This is Mr. Shea, American Pageant, AP United States History, Notre Dame High School. Okay, we start here just at the end of John Adams' second term as president, and we start with the election of 1800. The election of 1800, sometimes called the Revolution of 1800, finds the Federalists really struggling to be a unified party, and John Adams at the head of the party, uh, really reaps the negative consequences of that struggle, the party struggle. Different reasons for this struggle. One of those reasons being the laws passed during the undeclared war with France, the Alien and Sedition laws, had created a lot of distrust of John Adams and the Federalist Party as being a power hungry party that would sacrifice individual liberties for the gain of the central government. The other problem that Adams faced on the other side of that were the opponents within his own party, including Alexander Hamilton, who were upset that so many military preparations were made and the Navy was built up at such a rapid pace. The debt had ballooned as a result of all these expenditures, and there was no war fought. The term "all dressed up but no place to go" was very applicable at this time as a result of the buildup of the anticipated war with France that actually never happened. Had John Adams actually gone ahead and fought the war with France, it is likely he would have been reelected with full support of his Federalist Party. The Jeffersonian Republicans, especially Thomas Jefferson, faced their own criticisms during this time. It was the first real mudslinging, first time that two solidified political parties were running against each other. 1796 saw two political parties, but Jeffersonians had grown much stronger and influential at this time. Jefferson was called a godless man, where Adams was called a monarchist. Jefferson was accused of fathering several children by his slave women, robbing a widow. So these stories were put out there. Some were true, including his longtime relationship with Sally Hemings. But these were put out in the papers as often as possible to discredit Thomas Jefferson. He was also considered a very liberal when it came to religion, being the leader to separate church and state in Virginia. Your book talks about many New England women, Congregationalists, of course, who felt so nervous and apprehensive towards Jefferson's election that they were said to hide their Bibles for fear that he would order them all repossessed, I guess, or taken by the government. They accused him of being an atheist. Ultimately, Jefferson wins majority, 73 electoral votes to 65. We'll show why. One of the biggest reasons was New York. New York swayed. If Hamilton had supported Adams publicly, Adams likely would have won. Instead, Aaron Burr in New York was enormously influential in pulling the right strings to get Jefferson a narrow victory in the Electoral College in New York and delivering the election to Jefferson. New Englanders, especially, and others in the North who supported Adams, claimed that the Three-Fifths Clause of the Constitution was the primary reason why Jefferson had won, and that made it an unfair election. Remember, the Three-Fifths Clause deals with representation in Congress. For every 5 slaves, 3 additional representatives in each state are granted, and the Electoral College grants as many votes in each state as there are representatives. So the more representatives you have, the more powerful your state is in the electoral college, and thus the South having these really phantom representatives, because clearly they didn't represent the slaves that they were counted for, gave those southern states a louder voice in the electoral college and an unfair advantage. It's actually pretty true and accurate, and it's what many claimed happened during this time, the election of 1800. So, although Jefferson won the election, the Electoral College is set up. Remember that second place, and this is going to change with the 12th Amendment, where we have it today, where you run on a party ticket. But back then, it was first place as president, second place as vice president. Remember that Thomas Jefferson actually served as John Adams' vice president. Well, Aaron Burr is clearly the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Republican Party, but there's a mistake made, and what they would try to do is just have 1 or 2 less votes in each state, so that your clear choice for vice president, that was the idea in this, would not receive as many as you did, as many as Jefferson did. That didn't happen, and Jefferson and Burr tie 73 to 73. And any normal person would have understood that since this party was named after Jefferson, that Jefferson was clearly the choice. But ultimately, the vote falls to the House of Representatives in the event of a tie in the Electoral College. Aaron Burr also could have done more to dampen the excitement over this by just clearly saying he was not interested, but that's not Aaron Burr. That's not who he was, which we're going to see more of. Aaron Burr was, in many ways, unstable when it came to his mental approach to politics. We'll talk about it in a few slides. Sometimes the election of 1800 was considered or talked about, and Jefferson himself, as a revolution of 1800 because he believed it was going to bring back, that the Federalists had violated a lot of the principles of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and 1787 in the Constitution. But truly, it wasn't a revolution it wasn't that. It was more of a positive that there can be a transfer of power peacefully in the United States. It really symbolized that the Constitution had worked, that this great experiment had worked in democracy. And although Jefferson believes he was going to restore what the Republic was really supposed to be about, it was really a sign that the country could transfer power between two political parties peacefully. Remember, in many places around the world and throughout history, when this would occur, the refusal of the occupying political party in power using the military to defend and not allow the election to stand. These things would happen in other places, and it didn't happen here. So it was actually a very successful election in that way. This shows the Electoral College, and you see the votes below here, 73-73 for Jefferson, Adams, and Pinckney. Clearly, the biggest state was New York, a state carried by Adams in the previous election, expected to be a Federalist state in the North. But because of Burr's fairly manipulative political actions in New York, he's able to get enough votes to go towards Jefferson, and that really is the key to the whole election. So Jefferson's inaugurated in 1801 on March 4th. Remember, he is the first president to be inaugurated in the new capital city of Washington, D.C. It was under construction during much of John Adams' presidency. He did actually move into the White House towards the end of his term. It wasn't even complete at that time. The city is nothing like we know it today. It was very modest. In fact, Jefferson believed it was perfect because it didn't stand out like Philadelphia did, as far as being aristocratic in any way. Jefferson also changes many of the norms of the president. He is a very casual dresser, casual speech, eliminates the formalities and etiquettes that the Federalists had used, even at formal dinners, with like sitting, in a certain seat based on your rank or political rank. So these types of etiquettes he did away with, which to some was very insulting, but it clearly established his belief in that the federal government should not be all powerful and elitist. So one of the things that Jefferson has to deal with as he takes office is the reality that political theory is very different than political application. He believed very strongly in a weak central government, in state rights, in the protection of individual liberties, in being a strict constructionist. But the reality of being in the office forced him to go against many of his core political ideologies, which he certainly would not have wanted to do, but it's different when he realized it was different being in the office. It was much more difficult to stay true to his ideological beliefs while in office versus looking at somebody else in that same seat. Although Jefferson had new ideas, and he does quickly go about changing things, such as, well, the alien sedition laws automatically expire anyway during his term, but he pardons those in jail. we're going to talk about in a second here what goes on with the Alien Act and bringing it back to more reasonable uh, length and time for people to apply for and gain citizenship. But he doesn't change too much in that the offices held in the cabinet, uh, his offices that he controlled, he allows Federalists to remain in their posts. This upsets many who believe that they would receive jobs as a result of Jefferson winning the office. So he was very moderate in that, which was a good thing and a good precedent to establish because it showed that there could be a transfer of power and not everything had to just be flipped over 180 degrees and changed completely, that there could be moderation and compromise, and so the other party still had a voice in government. You guys can take a look at these pictures in the book if you'd like. All right, so I already talked about the Alien Sedition laws that had expired and the pardoning of those in prison as a result of the Sedition Act. The Naturalization Law in 1802, passed by Jefferson, brought the requirement for citizenship from 14 back to 5 years. So the Alien Sedition laws are repealed as he promised. He does repeal the excise tax, which he believed was unfair. Remember, he supported the Whiskey Rebellion because he believed it was too directly targeted at farmers. His Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, very much agreed with Jefferson in the reduction of the national debt. He did not believe the country should carry a large burden, so he goes about being very responsible, balancing the budget. The country still carries a debt, but he doesn't believe in expanding the debt as Hamilton would have believed. But other than that, when it came to import taxes and when it came to the national bank, uh, none of this is challenged by Jefferson. They keep all of these programs in place moving forward. So much bitterness between Hamilton and Jefferson during Washington's presidency. And Jefferson really, once in office, does not change tariff policy, does not change national bank policy. In fact, Jeffersonian Republicans are going to extend the national bank. So goes a little bit against what many probably would have thought he would have done in those areas. The judiciary branch was a really interesting thing. Remember that John Jay, the first Chief Justice, is sent actually to negotiate a treaty because nobody really, during Washington's administration, because, and he does with Jay's treaty, nobody really knew what the Supreme Court was going to do, like what their actual role was. And it was written in the contract, but not clearly what it was going to do. Well, this is established during Jefferson's presidency, and really to his dismay. The Judiciary Act of 1801 was one of the last laws passed by the Federalists while they still held power. And remember, I forgot to mention this, that Jefferson, I forgot to mention this going back 6 slides, but Jefferson won the presidency in the House of Representatives on the 36th ballot, I believe, 35th or 36th ballot against Aaron Burr. And the reason it was such a stalemate is there's so many Federalists and they're in Congress still, and they were lame duck. That means they were already voted out, but they were still in power, that they made it very difficult for Jefferson to actually take the office. Okay, so 1801, the Federalists passed a law prior to 1801, but it goes into effect in 1801, and this allowed for the extension, the adoption of more federal judgeships, 16. And remember, the president is the one who appoints these. So John Adams was the one who was able to appoint these midnight judges, quote unquote. And remember that a judge has a lifetime term. So if a president appoints a judge that is like-minded in their political viewpoints of the party, the Federalist Party, for example, then what has happened and what the Jeffersonian Republicans accuse them of is they have implanted Federalist ideologies in one of the three major branches of government, and they can't be taken out. So that is a very impressive power play by the Federalists at the last hour. So the new elected Congress repeals the Judiciary Act of 1801 before it can really go into effect. And there are other appointees who make it in anyway, because they do expand the judicial system. They just rewrite it. And one of those individuals, John Marshall, and John Marshall will serve as Chief Justice for over 3 decades. He becomes the most influential Chief Justice in American history. He is a staunch Federalist. He believes very strongly in a strong central government, and his rulings will reflect that ideology of the Federalist Party during the reign, really, of the Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans. One of the key cases that established Marshall's and the Supreme Court's power was Marbury versus Madison. William Marbury was appointed justice, one of the midnight judges by John Adams. He's really an unimportant person here, but James Madison doesn't deliver his paperwork in time and therefore blocks his appointment. Marbury sues. Now, Marshall dismisses Marbury's suit, so Marbury ultimately loses this. But he, in his decision, cites the Judiciary Act of 1789, where in that judicial, well, it's I'm actually unclear on the exact detail of what he dismissed as being the reason, but in his decision, he shows or calls on the idea that the law was actually not constitutional, that the law was not valid. And this way of looking at a case from the Supreme Court perspective established judicial review. And judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws, and thus makes the Supreme Court the final determiner on whether or not a law passed is or is not constitutional. It seems like something we're established that we're so used to now, and that would be make plenty of sense, but it was not established until Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury versus Madison, 1803, John Marshall's ruling is a landmark case because it establishes judicial review and thus establishes how the Supreme Court will run and will make itself a equal part, the three branches of government, for the remainder of American history. So a very important case, a landmark case for the Supreme Court during this time, and Marshall really extended the power of the Supreme Court as a result. Now, Jefferson's upset with this. He understands what has just happened. He urged Congress to impeach a Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. Now, why? Samuel Chase was extremely outspoken Federalist who would go in the papers, who would give interviews, who would be brazen at social events. And Jefferson and Jeffersonians believed that this was not what the Supreme Court was supposed to be about. They're supposed to be impartial. And they charged him with high crimes. And tried to impeach the Supreme Court justice. Now, it fails. It passed in the House, but it failed in the Senate. It established a really strong precedent that Supreme Court justices could not just be removed based on their political beliefs. Had that changed, then it's possible that either the legislative branch or the executive branch would have control over the judicial branch. Okay, so Jefferson, remember when he first comes into office, part of his other plan is to reduce the military significantly to a mere 25,000 police force. He orders the dismantling of much of the Navy, cancels all future orders on future ships, being warships. But then he faces problems early on in North Africa and the Barbary states. There were bribes that were always paid to pirates that were common in these areas. I'll show you a map here. There we go. And you can see here in the Mediterranean, there's several pirates that existed in these areas, and there were bribes that were paid to these individuals. Well, it was much resented that these were paid, and eventually it led to war in the Barbary states. Now, it lasts for a few years, and the Americans are successful mainly because of the inadequacy of the pirates. And the American warships used are very small ships, tiny gunboats, which Jefferson falls in love with, commissions more to be built. They're actually not that effective. That just so happen to work there because of the pirates' lack of power ships, any kind of numbers. And the Federalists will laugh, when there's a big storm, one of the ships is pushed so far inland. that's it's so light and lacked any real relevance. But at the end, this war is won, and it's a victory for the Americans. The reluctant Jefferson had to fight it to avoid trade. Excuse me, trade being disrupted in that area. Louisiana. This is extremely important topic of the Jefferson presidency. Napoleon gains the territory of New Orleans and the Louisiana territory is a vast territory west of the Mississippi River as a result of a treaty with the Spanish. And at that point, the Americans lose their agreement or their ability to move goods down the Mississippi and out the Gulf of Mexico, which they had made under the Pinckney Treaty in 1795 with Spain. So Americans are upset. They're outraged. They need to be able to move goods out of New Orleans. Jefferson sends James Monroe to Paris and to meet up with Livingston, who's already there negotiating with Napoleon, and he's instructed to buy New Orleans for $10 million. But Napoleon, as a result of a couple of things that are going on right now, one, his inability in Haiti to take the island without really taking on staggering casualties and costs. Okay, that along with other battles being fought in Europe, he decides that it's not worth it right now to fight a war, to try to pursue keeping the territory in Louisiana and West Mississippi. He thinks he could actually do more harm to the British by selling the entire territory to America and really giving the Americans a strategic advantage over the British who still resided in Canada. He decides to go along that route, and he sells or offers the United States all the territory for $15 million, which, if you look at all the vast territory in the Louisiana Purchase, is an enormous amount of land for such a small amount. In fact, there are homes just in New Orleans alone that cost that much money today. So it was an impressive purchase. But remember that Jefferson was a strict constructionist, and nowhere in the Constitution, and he'd only authorized Monroe and Livingston to spend 10. They come back with a treaty that says 15. Jefferson knows and actually tries to get an amendment passed, but it fails that. He knows that this is not constitutional, but he can't say no. It's such a great opportunity, and he justifies it as it's going to be a vast experiment in enormous amount of land and democracy, and he believes they could just extend the principles that he believes strongly in. But this was an enormous purchase. It doubled the size of the United States, really with just the signing of one document. The Louisiana Purchase also opens the doors. The United States is really the idea of the United States to be a power. I mean, just the sheer size and the sheer resources that are now going to be available, the ability for the population to grow and move west, the new markets that are going to be opened up. But clearly, there are some other things that are going to have to be dealt with, including Native Americans in these areas. Once again, are going to fight for, and rightfully so, right, their ability to survive in these areas. So the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark, Meriwether Lewis was Jefferson's personal secretary. They embark on a 2.5 year expedition where they see their way all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They face so many different obstacles, near-death experiences, collected enormous amounts of information, saw the vast resources, the amount of animals, the large herds of buffalo, got an idea of the tribes that lived in these areas, and really paved the way for future exploration and settlement of the newly purchased lands. Okay, Aaron Burr. Let's get back to Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr is a very unique personality in American history. I already talked about his defeat in the House of Representatives to Jefferson, even though he was on Jefferson essentially is on his ticket as his vice president. He's very outspoken, and he's not afraid of controversy. After his dismissal, Jefferson no longer, wants him to be involved in his cabinet. He dismisses Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr, upset with Jefferson, joins the Federalists in New England, becomes an extremist, tries to get them to plot for secession. New England actually secede and become its own country. He later is exposed during this whole plot by Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton, even though he hated or didn't like Jefferson, did not want someone going around. Remember, strong central government, strong Federalists did not want someone going around talking about secession and breaking up the federal government he had worked so hard to build. Well, so he tells Jefferson. Now, Aaron Burr, outraged, challenges Hamilton to a duel. Duels were outlawed in most states at this point, but not all states. Hamilton despises duels, but believes his honor's at stake, shows up to the duel, refuses to fire Aaron Burr. Remember, not psychologically stable in every way, fires and kills Alexander Hamilton. It's interesting that even duels back then, most of the time, did not end in death. It was considered ungentlemanly to aim for a kill shot. But of course, Aaron Burr did. He then turns his plots to west of the Mississippi, where he sets up an alliance with General James Wilkinson, who's the governor of the Louisiana Territory, sometimes a secret agent for Spain, and they decide to begin plotting a way to separate or secede again with the territories west of the Mississippi and form their own confederacy. Wilkinson learns that Jefferson is aware of these plots. He abandons Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr is arrested, tried for treason. Chief Justice John Marshall says you actually need hard evidence, not just the intent to commit treason in order to be convicted of it. Aaron Burr is found innocent, flees to Great Britain, where then he politically tries to maneuver ways to get Britain and France to ally themselves and invade the United States. So Aaron Burr showed an enormous amount of hatred for the United States government, driven by lack of stability psychologically and anger over his political or lack of political assent. This shows you, this is a good map. It shows where the United States was in green here prior to the Louisiana Purchase and how much territory was gained as a result of the Louisiana Purchase and where Lewis and Clark's expedition actually went. And here's Pike, and where Pike's Peak. Okay, we're going to talk about here when we get to the Mexican-American War, where the United States begins to acquire this land, which will be the next real large acquisition of land and the completion almost of the continental United States. Election of 1804, Jefferson wins in a landslide, and but at this point he walks again into a very difficult situation because Great Britain and France reassumed their war, which will last now for 11 years. And at first, it worked okay for the United States because they were supplying raw materials to both the British and the French. But as a result of you look at these two battles, and what's the significance of these two battles? Well, what came out of both these battles is that the French had the strongest land force, the strongest army in the world. They controlled the land. But the British had the strongest fleet, so they controlled the ocean. And so from this, both issue, the London First, the Orders in Council, which basically closed the European ports under French control to foreign shipping, including American. So the British are now closing these ports, which is eliminating the American ability to trade. Well, the French respond, where if you did trade with a country that, or if you trade in an area that the French controlled, they now began to do the same thing. So, but just on land, where they would seize goods once the American fleet landed. So, the Americans are facing really the inability to trade with either nation, and this is devastating to the American economy. In addition, the practice of impressment picks up again, and the British would force American merchant marines, or sorry, not merchant marines, American tradesmen who were, just normal employees, shipmen, would be captured and forced to serve in the British Navy, which was just a terrible experience and very unfair. And Americans were outraged by these things. Then the Chesapeake affair. Remember, the Chesapeake is an actual U.S. warship. The British demand the surrender of four alleged deserters, which was probably just made up. The American commander aboard the Chesapeake refused. They were fired upon. Men were killed, and the four individuals were taken. So Americans, and of course, London says sorry for this. Said it was a mistake. But now Jefferson, a peace lover, a person who's reduced the Navy, severely finds himself challenged by many in Congress, by Americans, to do something. Remember also that there are war hawks. Now I'm trying to skip ahead here and I'll come back. Well, we'll just go back to it in a second. These new congressmen from the West who are just calling for war, they're going to be coming in as a result of these attacks by the British during the time, especially the Chesapeake. They're going to be, or they're going to be able to rise to power as a result of Jefferson's perceived international weakness when it came to dealing with the British and the French. Jefferson understands that he has no ability to wage war. He goes instead the economic route with the Embargo Act of 1807, which completely forbids all goods to the United States to be shipped to either French or British ports. The idea was that the British and the French were so reliant on American raw goods and raw materials, they would come back begging and for the Americans to re-engage with trade. He was wrong. The embargo actually hurts American farmers more. The British and the French have other areas that they can turn to and control where they are fine when it came to raw materials. They didn't need the Americans as much as Jefferson had anticipated. It's extremely unpopular. Jefferson, as a result, is extremely unpopular towards the end of his second term as president. The Non-Intercourse Act is passed in 1809, which opens trade with all nations except for Britain and France to relieve some of the pressures. So, I kind of already talked about this. Why the embargo failed, that the French and the British had other places to go. But one unintended consequence of the Embargo Act was the growth of manufacturing and factories in the Northeast. As a result of the embargo, many in the Northeast turned to manufacturing their own goods, taking the raw materials to manufacture them, to sell them. And this is extremely important, and really the embargo can be credited in some ways with the birth of, or the reemergence of, the manufacturing system in the Northeast, which would turn the Northeast into the more powerful section, the North, the more powerful section and much wealthier section in the country moving forward. We kind of talked about that a slide ahead. Sorry, guys. James Madison is elected in 1809. He comes into this conflict that Jefferson just left with the British and the French. The Non-Intercourse Act was going to expire in 1810, and Congress decides that they are going to pass, or they do pass, Macon's Bill Number 2. Macon's Bill Number 2 is almost a bill that forces, or they thought would force, the British and the French to make a choice. It forces a race to make a choice. Who would make that choice first? And really, the idea was, if Britain or France repealed their commercial restrictions, right, whichever one did it first, America would restore its embargo against the non-repealing nation. So if France came to America first, America then would re-engage with this embargo with Britain, thus helping the French in their war efforts and hurting the British. To Madison, this was shameful because it allowed these two countries to determine what America's foreign policy would be, who it would side with, rather than allowing that decision to be made by the United States. Eventually, France does take the bait. Madison hopes and gives the British 3 months to rescind and do what France had done as well. And he was taking a gamble that the British would do this, but he failed at this. And it pushes the United States into a situation where it has no choice. It's allying itself with France, and it's going to lead to the War of 1812 at this point. Madison really was out of options with the British. I mentioned earlier, really as a result of Jefferson's policies, the Chesapeake, the Embargo Act, war hawks who had come into Congress mainly from the West were younger, more brash. They looked to not only take on the British more forcefully, but also the Native American tribes who were beginning to mount with some success opposition in the new settled West. So these warhawks wanted to deal with the Native Americans in a unified way and be more aggressive in how they dealt with the British. The first act or demonstration of this kind of more aggressive stance comes in the Battle of Tippecanoe. It starts with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, considered the prophet. They had done a great job for Native Americans of unifying many of the tribes and successfully creating a confederacy that was efficient and successful in their targeting of American settlers west. William Henry Harrison, in fall of 1811, decides to engage Tecumseh. Now Tecumseh is not there; he's the leader. He's south at this point. But Tenskwatawa makes the fateful decision, the bad decision, to engage in this battle, and the Shawnees are routed, and their settlement is destroyed. And the Battle of Tippecanoe made Harrison a national hero. Harrison will later run for president. He won't last long. He'll die of pneumonia after just 1 month because he gave his inauguration speech in the freezing rain. But at this point, Tecumseh is done. Their hopes of unification are gone. He ends up fighting with the British in the War of 1812 until he is killed in 1813. Okay, that's chapter 11. Good luck on the quiz tomorrow.